Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Reading Reviews by Ryan. It's been a while, I apologize. I've been caught up with some real life. Haven't been reading as much because I've been having too much fun. Sorry. However, I've been told time after 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 time again to shorten the damn video. So what I'm going to do is race through this and we'll see how well this works out. Perhaps my video retention will be higher. Big ideas. Today, what are we doing? The new Jim Crow. What an amazing piece. Now, this is a highly controversial piece, so I just want to throw that disclaimer out there that I am simply the messenger of Miss Michelle Alexander. I'm just going to give you the information that she has given me, and I still have a lot more reading to do to be knowledgeable on this subject because this is my first exposure, but wow, have my eyes been open to something that I never even thought of. Such is the power of reading. So, one sentence summary. What is this book about? Here it is. A racial caste system exists today in the form of mass incarceration. What were the other two racial caste systems she compares it to? First, obviously, we have slavery. Second, obviously, Jim Crow. And she says, a new racial caste system in the form of mass incarceration has evolved. It has adapted to the changes in the political, social, and legal context over time. One quote she says is, slavery didn't end, it evolved, which is crazy because the difference between slavery and Jim Crow and mass incarceration, these two, and the difference between this one, is that mass incarceration, nowhere at all is it overtly racist. You have to dig deep to see that it is targeting people of color, especially African Americans, to keep them in a suppressed state, an oppressed state. The word that I'll be using throughout this is colorblind, and that's what defines mass incarceration. And that's what she means by adapting to the political, social, and legal context. Because back in the day, believe it or not, a lot of people thought it was logical. Slavery, they thought they were doing African Americans a favor. So, and then they even backed it by the Bible. So any time you have, people will rationalize the behavior. So perhaps now, none of us are woke about this, but maybe this is the inkling of wokeness. Colorblind means that you can't prove that it is racist on the surface. You kind of have to dig and kind of imply, but the implications are quite obvious. But in the court of law, if there's not super straight up clear evidence, it's not going to fly. How is the system of mass incarceration racist? Well, it all started with the war on drugs back in '82 with Reagan. The war on drugs was really cracking down on drugs, even though back then it was not a real issue. But they decided to focus on crack cocaine. Even though powdered cocaine is the same exact thing, crack cocaine was used more in the ghettos with African Americans. Also, it didn't help that the media would portray African Americans as criminals, and we still see this today. So now, then you start to have government funding to both state and local police forces for arrests made on the drug war. So if you make more arrests and you meet your quota, you will get more funding. So this is where militarized policing became a thing, like the SWAT team and everything like that. It's probably not too surprising that Bush and Clinton also contributed to these funds, but what may be surprising is that Obama actually revamped these funds to local and state police departments. Now that the police have all this equipment, it's kind of at their discretion with whom they want to target for the war on drugs, because drugs are used everywhere across all races. You can see she has a lot of numbers and surveys where white people are actually as likely or more likely to use drugs than African Americans. But you can't search everybody. You can't find everybody. So you have to really seek out and search. And who's the easiest target and who in the nation has the image of being criminals? So at the discretion of police officers, the Fourth Amendment, which I believe is about just cause for stopping and searching, that became laxed because it seemed as though even though you didn't have to agree to a search, police kind of forced it on you and they made it seem like it was your only choice. An example of this are pretext stops. So let's say, for example, you have a broken headlight or you forgot to turn your turn signal on as you're making a right turn. You get stopped by the police, but then that escalates quickly into a drug search. That happens a lot with African Americans, still does. This book, by the way, was written in 2010, and we can see obviously that it is still super relevant to this day, which is sad because it seems like we've made strides since then, but we have not made any, it seems like. Once you're stopped and you're arrested and you're about to get convicted, it's really hard to get adequate legal representation, especially if they are appointed to you, because those are not the lawyers that get paid the big bucks. These public lawyers who get assigned to you, if you do not have the means to appoint one to yourself, they're overworked and underpaid. So they're just trying to get by, even though they're trying to do it for a good cause. It's not going to be the best legal representation. And furthermore, she gives a couple example cases to which the Supreme Court immunizes mass incarceration. So it makes it very, very difficult to make a case for racism in these drug arrests because it asks for blatant racist evidence of which does not exist because this is a colorblind society. So nobody's saying, I'm arresting this guy because he's black. They don't say that ever. They say, I arrest this guy because he seems suspicious. Now, the reason for him being suspicious are highly subjective, but you still cannot argue in the court of law. Here is the meat and potatoes of the book. This is crazy. So when you are convicted of a felon and you get released from prison, you are now legally discriminated against because you are a felon. So now we make the tie between mass incarceration and a legal caste system. When you're targeting African Americans and people of color for the war on drugs, that is not overt racism. Then, now they have the felon label. Now they are legally discriminated against, right? So if the war on drugs was truly equal in who it seeked out to find to arrest, then yes, no, it would be good. But because the arrests are targeted at people of color, now afterwards you're legally discriminated against because of that felon label. So what happens when you are a felon? Well, we have housing discrimination. So once you're released from prison, there's very harsh screening by public housing agencies, and that is fueled by funding by the federal government too. So if they're not being super harsh with their screening, they're not going to get as much funding. Another thing huge that we've all seen and heard of at least is the box on job applications, college applications. Have you ever been convicted of a felony, right? So there's two for you. Now the third piece is paying off hefty debts upon being released from prison. That includes debts to probation departments, courts, child support enforcement officers, etc. And you can actually get tossed back into prison if you can't come up with the means for that. But how are they going to come up with the means for that? Because the box makes the chances of them getting a job way, way low. So the fourth thing is now food stamps. Drug-related felony convictions are permanently barred from federal-funded food assistance. Last but not least, voting rights. Once you're a felon, the state decides how they reinstitute your voting right. A lot of the times, it includes hefty fines, which this is a perpetual cycle. Get released, you can't get a job, so you can't make good money. How do you pay back the debt? You can't, so you go back to prison. Let's say you can pay the debt so you stay out of prison, but to get your voting rights back, you have to pay more fines. Or some states never allow you to get your voting rights back at all. Michelle Alexander, she compares these fines to vote to poll taxes back in the day. And it's notable that most felons are not in prison. Most of them, I think 2/3 of them, are either on parole or probation. And so when you're in probation or under parole, you're being highly scrutinized and looked at. If you violate your parole, back to prison, right? So it's a perpetual cycle where it's just trying to keep people of color at the bottom in this secondary class system. So one thing that was really interesting to note, you can make the argument that most people in prison are there because of violent crime. So if you take a snapshot of a prison, you say 50% is violent crimes, 50% is non-violent crimes. But that's just a snapshot. And then you take a snapshot 10 years down the road, 50-50 again, violent, non-violent. But the thing is, the non-violent crimes are cycled through that prison system way quicker than the violent crime people. So over that 10 years, you could have the same people in those violent crime cells, whereas so many people have been cycled through maybe 1, 2, 3 year sentences on the nonviolent crime. So you have a lot more people cycling through. So That is a debunked argument for prisons are there to protect you against crime. So now, these days, for people of my age or even a little bit older than me, mass incarceration doesn't strike us as abnormal. It strikes us as a normal thing. And why is that? Because we were not born during its inception. We were born afterwards. So this is how life is ever since we've been alive. And now also that's because in the history books, we've always seen racial caste systems have overt racism. But as said before, we're now in a colorblind time, so you can't do that because it's not socially acceptable. But we have to bring that into light. We have to recognize that because mass incarceration thrives on racial indifference, not overt racism. So it's kind of like an out of sight, out of mind type thing. I don't know anybody in prison. You don't know anybody in prison. We are not really associated with, so we don't really think about it, care about it, advocate for it. That allows the system to continue as is. Another argument against mass incarceration being a racial caste system is that, oh, well, white people are also affected by this mass incarceration. A lot of white people get arrested for drugs. Well, of course, because you cannot have 100% of colored people in your system because then that is grounds for overt racism. There is no variability, easy to spot. Another argument is that, oh, there are lots of African Americans that thrive even though we have a racial caste system. Well, of course, you have to have African Americans that thrive, or else it would be clear that you're suppressing African Americans, right? It seems what she says that this caste system is genius in the sense that it makes mass incarceration seems voluntary. It seems like a choice, when in fact it's the structure of mass incarceration, this targeting. And when you target something, it's very easy to find. The last note on mass incarceration is that it's a method of marginalization. Slavery, for example, was a method of exploitation. But what's scary and noted in her book is that exploitation might even be better than marginalization because at least in exploitation, you're needed. In marginalization, you're being pushed to the side, not needed. So finally, what do we do about this? We have to realize that colorblindness is actually blinding us. We have to bring race as the topic of conversation within this issue because if we don't, then just another caste system is going to take over. It's going to evolve as we've seen in the past. But it's tough though because mass incarceration is a huge problem. Even civil rights groups have a tough time tackling this because part of the problem is that they have become more focused on legal discourse. And when you're legally advocating for felons, it's not a great look. So there's a lot of political mumbo jumbo, not to mention money. Private companies that invest and create prisons are making bank. So if you try to get rid of a mass incarceration system and not have as many people in prison, a lot of people are going to lose a lot of jobs and they're going to lose a lot of money. So what can we do now? She says we need to change the public consensus. And that's almost more important or as important as getting legal wins. Because with legal wins, you can just absorb that into your system and it looks like a win, but in fact, it's just a quick hot fix and it's overlooking the structural stuff. So an example of this that she brings up is affirmative action. So now it seems like, okay, we give African Americans kind of a leg up with affirmative action. We ensure that they are not discriminated against in like education. And that looks like a win. Everybody takes it as a win. But then what that does is gloss over the structural stuff. You still have mass incarceration going on. Affirmative action will allow a small, tiny percentage to excel, but then the vast majority will still be stuck in that structural thing that is not going away. So she calls that kind of a cheap solution to the problem. Talk about race, change the public consensus, because once the public backs the legal stuff, then we can kind of see change. And I think that happened before with like the civil rights movement and everything. You had legal wins and you had a lot of marches. And we've seen marches these days, but not to the scale that they were back in the day, and I think for different reasons. Police brutality is a problem. And I saw a lot of defund the police movements. but I don't think that they were alluding to this mass incarceration. Basically, as the good old Martin Luther King used to say, we would like to focus on human rights, not civil rights. Thank you guys. See ya.